Chapter 8. Storm Surge. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon as Amelia made her way to the beach for the lobster race. The air was thick with the promise of an impending storm, matching the tumultuous emotions swirling in her chest. She spotted Lucas near the starting line, crouched down next to Sophie. The little girl was holding a bright red lobster, whispering what looked like last-minute encouragement to her crustacean competitor. As if sensing her presence, Lucas looked up. Their eyes met, and Amelia felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the static in the air. He smiled, warm and inviting, and beckoned her over. Amelia's feet carried her forward before her mind could protest. "Hey," she said, suddenly shy. "Ready for the big race?" Sophie beamed up at her. "Miss Pinchy is going to win for sure. Want to see her lucky shell?" Before Amelia could respond, Sophie thrust the lobster towards her. Startled, Amelia stumbled backwards, her heels sinking into the soft sand. She flailed, certain she was about to embarrass herself in front of half the town. But then strong arms were around her, steadying her. Amelia found herself pressed against Lucas's chest, his warmth seeping through her thin blouse. She looked up, her breath catching at their sudden proximity. "Whoa there," Lucas murmured, his voice low. "I've got you." For a moment, the world seemed to fade away. Amelia was acutely aware of Lucas's hand on the small of her back, the faint scent of his aftershave mingling with the salty air. A loud crack of thunder broke the spell. They jumped apart as if shocked, both a little breathless. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Due to the approaching storm, we'll be starting the race immediately. Contestants, please bring your lobsters to the starting line." Sophie squealed with excitement, completely oblivious to the charged moment between the adults. "Come on, Dad. Miss Pinchy needs us." As Sophie dragged Lucas away, he glanced back at Amelia. "Save me a seat," he mouthed. Amelia nodded, her heart racing as she found a spot on the bleachers. She watched as Lucas helped Sophie set her lobster at the starting line, his gentle interactions with his daughter making her chest tighten with an unfamiliar longing. The race was a blur of scuttling claws and cheering spectators. Amelia found herself swept up in the excitement, shouting encouragement to Sophie's lobster alongside Lucas. When Miss Pinchy crossed the finish line in second place, Sophie's joyous laughter was infectious. As the crowd began to disperse, fat raindrops started to fall. "Quick," Lucas said, grabbing Amelia's hand. "I know a shortcut back to town." They ran, Sophie perched on Lucas's shoulders, all three of them laughing as the rain intensified. Amelia couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so free, so alive. Lucas led them to a small boathouse near the pier. They ducked inside just as the sky opened up, rain pelting the roof in a deafening drum roll. "Well," Lucas said, running a hand through his wet hair. That was exciting. Amelia couldn't help but laugh. She knew she must look a mess, her carefully styled hair plastered to her face, her expensive blouse clinging to her skin. But somehow she didn't care. "That was amazing," Sophie declared, her eyes shining. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" Lucas chuckled. "Let's see what the weather's like first, kiddo." He turned to Amelia, his expression softening. "You okay?" "You're shivering." Before she could respond, he was shrugging off his jacket and draping it over her shoulders. The warmth of it, combined with his lingering body heat, made Amelia's breath hitch. "Thanks," she murmured, acutely aware of how close he was standing. A particularly loud clap of thunder made Sophie jump. "Dad," she said, her voice small. "I'm scared." Lucas immediately knelt down beside her. "Hey, it's okay, sweetie. It's just a storm. Why don't you tell Amelia about Miss Pinchy's lucky shell? That'll help take your mind off it." As Sophie launched into an elaborate tale about finding the perfect sand dollar, Amelia watched Lucas. The tenderness in his eyes as he listened to his daughter, the gentle way he stroked her hair. It stirred something deep within her. For a moment, Amelia allowed herself to imagine being part of this. Rainy day adventures, impromptu storytelling sessions, the three of them huddled together, safe and warm despite the storm raging outside. The image was so vivid, so achingly beautiful, that it took her breath away. Lucas must have sensed her gaze. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers over Sophie's head. The intensity she saw there made her stomach flip. "Hey, Soph," he said, his eyes never leaving Amelia's. "Why don't you see if you can count how many boats are in here? I bet you can't find them all." As Sophie scampered off to explore the boathouse, Lucas stood and moved closer to Amelia. "So," he said softly, "still up for that coffee?" Amelia laughed, gesturing to the rain-lashed windows. "I think we might have to take a rain check." Lucas's lips quirked in a smile. "I don't know. I kind of like where we ended up instead." He was standing so close now that Amelia could see the droplets of rain clinging to his eyelashes. Her heart pounded in her chest as Lucas slowly, tentatively, reached out to brush a wet strand of hair from her cheek. "Amelia," he murmured, his voice husky. Dad!" Sophie's excited voice cut through the moment. "I found a treasure map." Lucas closed his eyes for a second, a rueful smile playing on his lips. Then he stepped back, his hand falling away from Amelia's face. "Coming, sweetie." As he moved to join Sophie, Amelia let out a shaky breath she hadn't realised she'd been holding. Her skin tingled where Lucas had touched her, and she could still feel the weight of his gaze. She watched as Lucas examined Sophie's treasure map, which appeared to be an old nautical chart, their heads bent together in serious discussion. The sight made her heart ache with a bittersweet longing. For the first time since arriving in Rockport, Amelia allowed herself to truly imagine a future here. Lazy Sunday mornings with Lucas, helping Sophie with her homework, family dinners filled with laughter and love. It was a vision so tantalizingly close she could almost taste it. But as the storm continued to rage outside, doubt crept in like the damp chill in the air. Could she really give up everything she'd worked for in New York? And even if she did, was she ready to be not just a partner, but a parent? The uncertainty must have shown on her face, because when Lucas glanced her way again, his expression was a mix of hope and hesitation. There was a question in his eyes, one that Amelia wasn't sure she was ready to answer. As Sophie's excited chatter filled the small boathouse, Amelia hugged Lucas's jacket tighter around herself. She was caught in a storm of her own making, tossed between the safe harbour of her old life and the uncharted waters of a future with Lucas and Sophie. For now, all she could do was wait for the storm to pass, and hope that when it did, the path forward would become clear. Chapter 9. Cross Currents. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the air fresh with the scent of salt and wet earth. Amelia stood on the balcony of her B&B, clutching a mug of coffee as she watched the town come to life below. Her phone buzzed insistently on the bedside table inside. She glanced at it, seeing her editor's name flash on the screen for the third time that morning. With a sigh, she stepped back into the room and picked it up. "Hello? Amelia? Finally. Where's that draft?" The deadline was yesterday. Amelia's stomach clenched. She glanced at her laptop, the document still frustratingly blank. "I'm still working on it. It's coming along. I just need a little more time." "More time? Amelia, this isn't like you. Is everything okay?" She opened her mouth to reassure her editor, to promise the article would be in his inbox by the end of the day. Instead, what came out was, "I'm not sure." A pause on the other end. Then softer, "Take the time you need." "But Amelia, figure out what's going on. We need you focused for the big restaurant opening next week." The call ended, leaving Amelia staring at her phone. The mention of the upcoming assignment in New York felt like a bucket of cold water, shocking her out of the warm haze of possibility she'd been living in. With renewed determination, She sat at the small desk and opened her laptop. She had a job to do, a life to return to. This, whatever it was with Lucas, it was just a distraction, wasn't it? An hour later, Amelia found herself wandering the festival grounds, her notebook clutched uselessly in her hand. Every sight, every smell reminded her of moments shared with Lucas and Sophie, the lobster racing track, the sand sculpture area, the boathouse where they'd sheltered from the storm. Amelia! She turned to see Sophie running towards her, Lucas following at a more sedate pace. The little girl skidded to a stop in front of her, beaming. Guess what? Dad's making his famous lobster chowder for the cook-off today. You have to try it. Amelia's gaze flickered to Lucas, who shrugged with a mix of pride and embarrassment. It's not that famous, just an old family recipe. It's the best, Sophie insisted. Dad always wins. Will you be one of the judges, Amelia? Please? Amelia hesitated, torn between the warmth of Sophie's enthusiasm and the nagging voice reminding her of her unfinished article. I'm not sure I'm qualified. I should probably focus on my writing. Lucas's face fell slightly, but he quickly masked it with a smile. No pressure. I'm sure you're busy with your article. Something in his tone made Amelia's chest tighten. Before she could second-guess herself, she heard herself say, Actually, you know what? I'd love to be a judge. It would be great for the article. The way Lucas's face lit up made her heart skip a beat. As they walked towards the cooking area, Sophie chattering excitedly between them, Amelia's phone buzzed again. A text from her editor. Don't forget about the restaurant opening. Need to prep for your TV segment. Amelia stared at the message, a wave of panic washing over her. She'd completely forgotten about the television interview. It was a huge opportunity, one that could catapult her career to new heights. Everything okay? Lucas asked, concern etching his features. Amelia forced a smile. Yeah, just work stuff. Nothing important. Lucas nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. Before he could press further, they reached the cooking area. All right, chef, Lucas said, turning to Sophie. Ready to be my sous chef? Sophie nodded eagerly, donning a miniature apron that matched Lucas's. As Amelia watched them work together, measuring ingredients and stirring the pot, she felt a pang of longing so intense it nearly took her breath away. This is what she could have. A family, a home, love. But as her phone buzzed again in her pocket, she was reminded of what she'd be giving up, her career, her independence, the life she'd worked so hard to build. As the cooking competition progressed, Amelia found herself torn between two worlds. She laughed at Sophie's antics, felt her heart warm at Lucas's proud smiles, and marvelled at the easy camaraderie of the townsfolk. But every few minutes, her hand would drift to her phone, checking for messages from New York. When it came time to judge the chowders, Amelia approached Lucas's station with a mix of anticipation and dread. He ladled a generous portion into a bowl, his fingers brushing hers as he handed it over. Hope you like it, he said softly, his eyes searching hers. Amelia took a spoonful, and her eyes widened. It was perfect, rich and creamy, with a depth of flavour that spoke of years of perfecting the recipe. It tasted like home. Lucas, this is... She began, but was cut off by her phone ringing loudly. She fumbled for it, seeing her editor's name once again. I'm so sorry, I have to take this. As she stepped away to answer the call, she caught a glimpse of disappointment flashing across Lucas's face. The conversation was brief, but when Amelia returned, the moment was gone. Lucas was busy cleaning up his station, his posture stiff. Lucas, He turned to her, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. It's okay, Amelia, I get it. You have a life to get back to. The words hit her like a physical blow. Because he was right, wasn't he? She did have a life to get back to. A life that didn't include quaint fishing towns, impromptu lobster races, or... him. As the festival continued around them, Amelia felt the gulf between them widening. She stood on the precipice of two possible futures, unable to take a step in either direction. The sun began to set over the harbour, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Amelia found herself at the edge of the pier, watching the fishing boats return for the evening. She felt, rather than heard, Lucas approach. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not touching. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. Amelia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You know," Lucas continued, his voice low, "I always thought I'd leave this place, see the world, become a famous chef in some big city." Amelia turned to look at him, surprised. What changed? Lucas's gaze remained on the horizon. Life, I guess. Sarah. Sophie. I realised that sometimes the most extraordinary things can be found in the most ordinary places. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Amelia felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Lucas, But before she could finish, her phone rang once again. They both stared at it as it buzzed insistently in her hand. Lucas sighed, stepping back. "You should get that. Sounds important." As he walked away, leaving her alone on the pier, Amelia felt as though she were watching her chance at happiness recede with the tide. She looked down at her still ringing phone, then back at Lucas's retreating figure. Two paths stretched out before her, equally alluring and terrifying. The choice, she realised, was hers to make. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, Amelia had never felt more lost at sea. Chapter 10. Riptide. The final day of the Lobster Festival dawned grey and overcast, mirroring the storm brewing in Amelia's chest. She stood at the window of her B&B, watching seagulls wheel against the leaden sky, her packed suitcase a silent accusation behind her. Her phone chirped with a message from her editor. "Car will pick you up at 2 p.m. Don't be late for your flight. Big day tomorrow." Amelia's fingers hovered over the keys, a dozen responses flitting through her mind. In the end, she simply typed, "I'll be there." The festival grounds were a flurry of activity as Amelia arrived, notepad clutched like a shield. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of the week she'd spent here, of Lucas and Sophie, of laughter and possibility. "Amelia." Sophie's voice cut through the crowd. The little girl barreled towards her, all flying curls and gap-toothed grin. "You're just in time. Dad's about to announce the festival king and queen." Before Amelia could protest, Sophie was tugging her towards the main stage. Lucas stood at the microphone, looking effortlessly handsome in a button-down shirt and khakis. Their eyes met as Amelia approached, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Then Lucas cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to announce this year's Lobster Festival royalty." As Lucas read out the names of the winners, a retired fisherman and his wife, beloved fixtures of the community, Amelia found her gaze drawn to him. The easy way he commanded the crowd's attention, the warmth in his voice as he spoke about the town's traditions, it all served to tighten the knot of confusion in her chest. The ceremony concluded with the crowning of the winners, amidst cheers and applause. As the crowd began to disperse, Lucas made his way towards Amelia and Sophie. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "I was hoping I'd see you before—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavily between them. "Yeah, Amelia began, but was cut off by a commotion near the harbour. "Lucas!" Maggie's voice rang out, panic evident in her tone. "The storm surge, the lobster tanks." Lucas's eyes widened. Without a word, he took off running towards the harbour, Amelia and Sophie close behind. They arrived to find chaos. The unexpected storm surge had knocked over several of the festival's lobster tanks. Volunteers were scrambling to rescue the escaped crustaceans, while others fought to secure the remaining tanks against the rising water. "Sophie, stay here with Amelia," Lucas ordered, already rolling up his sleeves. "I need to help." But Sophie had other ideas. "No, I want to help too." Before anyone could stop her, she darted towards the waterline. "Sophie!" Lucas yelled, fear lacing his voice. Amelia didn't think, she just moved. She raced after Sophie, her heart pounding in her ears. The little girl had reached one of the overturned tanks and was trying to lift a lobster that was nearly as big as she was. Just then, a larger wave crashed over the seawall. Amelia saw Sophie lose her footing, teetering dangerously close to the churning water. Time seemed to slow. Amelia lunged forward, grabbing Sophie and pulling her back just as another wave crashed over them. They fell backwards onto the wet concrete, Amelia cradling Sophie protectively against her chest. For a moment, all Amelia could hear was the roar of the waves and her own ragged breathing. Then Sophie's small voice piped up, "You saved me." Amelia looked down at the little girl in her arms, soaked and shivering but unharmed. A wave of emotion hit her, so powerful it left her breathless. "Sophie!" Lucas's frantic voice cut through the chaos. He dropped to his knees beside them, gathering them both in his arms. "Are you okay? What were you thinking?" As Sophie launched into an explanation, Amelia became acutely aware of Lucas's arm around her, his warmth seeping through her drenched clothes. She looked up, meeting his gaze. The fear and relief she saw there made her heart clench. For a moment, wrapped in Lucas's embrace with Sophie safe between them, Amelia could see it all so clearly. The life she could have here, the family she could be part of. But then reality came crashing back like another wave over the seawall. Her flight, her career, the life she'd built in New York. It all seemed to be slipping away, and the thought terrified her. She pulled away abruptly, standing on shaky legs. I should go. My flight." Lucas stood too, confusion and hurt flickering across his face. "Amelia, wait. We should talk." But Amelia was already backing away, her fight-or-flight response in full gear. "I'm sorry, I can't. I have to go." As she turned and fled, she caught a glimpse of Lucas's face, a mix of disappointment, understanding, and something that looked heart-wrenchingly like resignation. Amelia ran all the way back to her B&B, her clothes dripping and her lungs burning. She barely made it inside before the tears started falling. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, sobs racking her body. What was she doing? She'd nearly lost Sophie. She'd seen the life she could have here, held it in her arms for one perfect moment. And now she was running away from it all. But the thought of staying, of upending her entire life for a man she'd known for a week and a little girl who wasn't hers, it paralyzed her with fear. Her phone buzzed insistently. A text from her editor. "Car's on its way. Don't miss this flight, Amelia. Your future's waiting in New York." Amelia stared at the message, tears blurring her vision. Her future. But what kind of future would it be without the warmth of Lucas's smile or the sound of Sophie's laughter? She glanced at her packed suitcase, then out the window towards the harbour where she knew Lucas and Sophie were. Two paths stretched out before her, both terrifying in their own way. As the minutes ticked by, Amelia remained frozen, torn between the safety of her old life and the unknown possibilities of a new one. Outside, the storm continued to rage, a fitting backdrop to the turmoil in her heart. The honk of a car horn cut through her indecision. Her ride to the airport had arrived. It was time to choose. Chapter 11. Undertow. The steady hum of the airplane engine filled Amelia's ears as she stared out the small window, watching Rockport disappear beneath the clouds. Her hand clutched the armrest, knuckles white, as if she could anchor herself to the life she was leaving behind. New York's familiar skyline came into view, a forest of steel and glass that once represented all her dreams and ambitions. Now, it loomed before her like a cage of her own making. As Amelia stepped into her apartment, The silence hit her like a physical force. No seagulls crying, no distant laughter from the harbour, no Sophie's excited chatter or Lucas's warm chuckle. Just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muffled sounds of traffic far below. She dropped her suitcase by the door and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The city sprawled out before her, vast and impersonal. Her reflection stared back, a stranger in her own home. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor. "Big day tomorrow. Get some rest, superstar." Amelia's stomach churned. She should be excited. This was what she'd worked for, her big break, a chance to become a household name in the culinary world. So why did it feel like she was about to step off a cliff? Sleep eluded her that night. She tossed and turned, her dreams a confusing mix of crashing waves, Sophie's laughter, and Lucas's disappointed face as she ran away. Morning came too soon. Amelia stood in front of her closet, surrounded by designer outfits that suddenly felt like costumes. She reached for a crisp white blouse, but her hand faltered, drawn instead to the soft flannel shirt she'd worn on her last day in Rockport. It still smelled faintly of sea salt and Lucas's aftershave. Shaking her head, she forced herself to don the blouse and a pencil skirt. Professional, polished, everything she'd worked so hard to become. The TV studio was a whirlwind of activity. Makeup artists fussed over her, a producer rattled off last-minute instructions, and before she knew it, Amelia was being ushered onto the set. And we're live in 3, 2, 1... Good morning, New York. The host's voice was bright and cheerful. Today we're joined by up-and-coming food critic Amelia Foster, here to tell us all about the hottest new restaurant in the city. Amelia, welcome. Amelia plastered on a smile, willing her voice not to shake. Thank you for having me. So, Amelia, tell us about this new culinary hotspot. What makes it so special? Amelia opened her mouth to recite her carefully prepared remarks, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could think about was Lucas's lobster chowder, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the feeling of belonging she'd experienced in that small coastal town. It's... She faltered, her mind blank. The host's smile wavered slightly. Amelia, are you all right? Amelia's heart raced. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead under the hot studio lights. I'm sorry, I can't do this. Before anyone could stop her, she was on her feet, stumbling off the set. She barely registered the confused shouts behind her as she burst out of the studio and onto the busy New York street. She walked for hours, her heels clicking on the pavement, oblivious to the curious glances from passers-by. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her bag, but she ignored it. As the sun began to set, Amelia found herself in Central Park. She sank onto a bench, her legs finally giving out. A couple walked by, hand in hand, lost in their own world. The sight made her chest ache with a longing so intense it took her breath away. She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over Lucas's number. What would she even say? That she'd made a terrible mistake? That she'd thrown away her career on live television for a chance at... What? A life she wasn't even sure she could handle. Just as she was about to press call, her phone lit up with an incoming call from her editor. Amelia's stomach dropped. With a shaky hand, she answered. Amelia? What the hell happened out there? Her editor's voice was a mix of concern and frustration. I don't know. I'm sorry, Sorry doesn't cut it, Amelia. Do you have any idea what you've done? The network is furious. Your credibility... As her editor continued, listing all the ways she'd jeopardized her career, Amelia felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She'd spent years chasing this dream, moulding herself into the perfect food critic, and in one moment, she'd thrown it all away. But still, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, was it really your dream? Or just what you thought you should want? Are you even listening to me? Her editor's voice cut through her thoughts. I hear you. Amelia said softly. And I understand. I'll face the consequences of my actions. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, get it together, Amelia. We might be able to salvage this, but I need you focused. No more small-town distractions, understood? The words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. Small-town distractions. Is that all Rockport had been? All Lucas and Sophie had been? I understand, she heard herself say, even as her heart rebelled against the words. As the call ended, Amelia stared at her phone. Her background was still a picture of the Rockport harbour at sunset. She'd meant to change it, to put her New York life firmly back in focus. But she hadn't been able to bring herself to erase that last tangible connection to the place that had started to feel like home. A notification popped up, an email from a popular food blog. The subject line made her blood run cold. Rising star food critic, Amelia Foster's on-air meltdown, career over. Amelia's vision blurred with unshed tears. She'd risked everything, destroyed the career she'd worked so hard to build. And for what? A man she'd known for a week? A little girl who wasn't hers? A life she wasn't even sure she could live? As the night settled over the park, Amelia remained on the bench, caught between two worlds. In one hand, her phone connected her to the ruins of her New York life. In the other, she clutched the sand dollar Lucas had given her, a token of a future she'd glimpsed but was too afraid to grasp. The choice that had seemed so clear in Rockport now felt impossible. Stay and fight for her career, proving to herself and everyone else that she belonged in this world of glitz and ambition. Or risk everything on a love she wasn't sure she deserved, in a life she wasn't sure she could navigate. As a cool breeze rustled the leaves around her, Amelia closed her eyes, feeling more lost than ever. The undertow of her conflicting desires threatened to pull her under, leaving her gasping for air and uncertain which way was up. Chapter 12. Breaking the surface. The harsh buzz of Amelia's alarm cut through the silence of her apartment. She blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling. For a fleeting second, she expected to smell salt air and hear seagulls. Instead, car horns and the distant rumble of the subway greeted her. She reached for her phone, her stomach clenching as she saw the flood of missed calls and messages. Her finger hovered over her editor's name before she set the phone down, unable to face the fallout just yet. Amelia padded to the kitchen, her movements mechanical as she prepared her morning coffee. The expensive espresso machine whirred to life, but as the rich aroma filled the air, she found herself longing for the simple drip coffee from Maggie's cafe. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the New York skyline stretched out before her. Once, this view had filled her with excitement and ambition. Now, it felt like a gilded cage. With a sudden burst of energy, Amelia strode to her closet. She pushed past the designer dresses and tailored suits, reaching for the back where a lone jacket hung. Lucas's jacket. He'd draped it over her shoulders during the storm, and she'd absent-mindedly packed it. Now it felt like a lifeline to a world she'd left behind. As she slipped it on, breathing in the faint scent of sea and aftershave, a calm settled over her. For the first time since returning to New York, her mind felt clear. Amelia grabbed her laptop, curling up on the couch as she opened her email. Her inbox was flooded with messages, from her editor, from concerned colleagues, from gossip columnists seeking a statement. But one subject line caught her eye. You forgot something. With her heart racing, Amelia clicked on the email from Lucas. There was no message, just an attachment. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was a photo of her notebook, the one she'd been using to write her article about the Lobster Festival. She must have left it behind in her haste to leave. But as she zoomed in on the image, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the margins of her neat handwriting, were little doodles and notes she didn't remember making. A sketch of the harbour at sunset, a list of Sophie's favourite ice cream flavours, and, scrawled in her own handwriting, maybe home isn't a place, Maybe it's a person. Tears blurred Amelia's vision. She'd been so focused on what she might lose by staying in Rockport that she'd failed to see what she'd be gaining. A chance at love. A family. A place where she truly belonged. Before she could second-guess herself, Amelia was on her feet, throwing clothes into a suitcase. Her phone buzzed insistently, her editor again, but this time she answered. "Amelia, finally. We need to discuss damage control." "I quit," Amelia interrupted, her voice steady and sure. "What?" "Amelia, think about what you're saying. Your career isn't what I want anymore," she finished. "I'm sorry, but I've made my decision." As she ended the call, Amelia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For years, she'd been chasing a dream that wasn't truly hers. Now she was finally brave enough to admit it. But what came next? The thought of returning to Rockport both thrilled and terrified her. A knock at the door startled Amelia from her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, and few people even knew she was home. Cautiously, she approached the door and looked through the peephole. Her heart leapt into her throat. Lucas. For a moment, Amelia couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, with trembling hands, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. There he stood, looking slightly dishevelled from travel, a familiar notebook clutched in his hand. His eyes, those warm brown eyes that had haunted her dreams, widened as they took her in. "Amelia," he breathed, relief and uncertainty mingling in his voice. "Lucas," she replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. "What are you... How did you..." He held up the notebook. "You left this behind. I thought... Well, I saw what happened on TV, and I thought maybe this was why, that you needed it for your segment." Amelia's eyes filled with tears at the gesture. He'd flown all this way, thinking he was helping her career. A career she'd just walked away from. "Oh, Lucas," she said, a watery laugh escaping her. "That's not... I mean, thank you, but... Can I come in?" he asked gently. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Amelia nodded, stepping back to let him enter. As he passed, she caught the scent of sea air and aftershave, so familiar and yet so out of place in her sterile New York apartment. Lucas looked around, taking in the sleek furniture and city view. "Nice place," he said, but Amelia could hear the unspoken question in his voice. "Is this really what you want?" "It's just a place," Amelia found herself saying. It never really felt like home. Lucas turned to her, hope and caution warring in his expression. And Rockport? Did that feel like home? Amelia's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. "Not Rockport," she said softly. You and Sophie, you felt like home." The smile that broke across Lucas's face was like the sun emerging from behind the clouds. He took a step towards her, then hesitated. "Amelia, I know it's a lot to ask. You have a life here. A career." "Had," Amelia corrected. At Lucas's confused look, she explained, "I quit. Just before you knocked, actually. I realised I've been chasing someone else's dream for so long, I'd forgotten what I really wanted." "And what do you want?" Lucas asked, his voice low and intense. Amelia met his gaze steadily. "A life that feels real, a chance at love, a family. You." Lucas closed the distance between them in 2 strides, gathering her in his arms. Amelia melted into his embrace, feeling for the first time in days like she could breathe properly. "I was so scared," Lucas murmured into her hair. "After you left, I thought I'd lost my chance, that I'd been a fool to think you could be happy in a small town with a widower and his daughter." Amelia pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "And now? Now?" Lucas smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Now I'm terrified, but in a good way. In an I can't wait to see what comes next way." Speaking of what comes next, Amelia said, suddenly realising. Where's Sophie? Please tell me you didn't leave her alone in Rockport. Lucas chuckled. Give me some credit. She's with Maggie. Practically had to pry them apart, actually. Maggie's teaching her how to make her famous blueberry muffins. The mention of Rockport, of Sophie and Maggie, made Amelia's chest ache with longing. I miss it, she admitted. All of it. The town, the people, the simplicity of life there. It misses you too, Lucas said softly. Then, taking a deep breath, he added, So what do you say? Ready to come home? Amelia looked around her apartment, at the life she'd built that suddenly felt hollow. Then she looked at Lucas, at the promise of love and family, and a life filled with purpose. Her heart swelled with a certainty she'd never felt before. But as she opened her mouth to reply, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was she really ready to leave everything behind? Could she truly fit into life in Rockport? The answers to those questions would have to wait. For now, standing in her New York apartment with Lucas, Amelia knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change forever. Chapter 13. Tides of Love. The salty breeze tousled Amelia's hair as she stood on the porch of her new home, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that reflected off the calm waters of Rockport Harbour. 6 months had passed since that pivotal moment in her New York apartment when Lucas had shown up at her door. 6 months of change, of adjustment, of finding her place in this small coastal town that had captured her heart. The screen door creaked open behind her, and strong arms wrapped around her waist. Amelia leaned back into Lucas's embrace, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Good morning, Lucas murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're up early. Amelia turned in his arms, taking in the sight of him. Hair mussed from sleep, eyes warm with love. I wanted to watch the sunrise, she said. I still can't get over how beautiful it is here. Lucas's smile was soft as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Not as beautiful as you. A year ago, Amelia might have rolled her eyes at such a cheesy line. Now it made her heart flutter. She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, marvelling at how right it felt, how perfectly they fit together. The moment was interrupted by the patter of small feet on hardwood floors. Dad, Amelia, you promised we could go tide pooling before school. They turned to see Sophie bouncing on her toes in the doorway, already dressed in her rain boots and jacket despite the warm morning. Amelia laughed, extricating herself from Lucas's arms. We did promise, didn't we? Go get the buckets while I pack some snacks. As Sophie dashed off, Lucas caught Amelia's hand, his expression suddenly serious. You okay with this? I know it's a big change from your life in New York. Amelia's response was to pull him in for another kiss, pouring all her love and certainty into it. When they parted, both a little breathless, she said, I've never been more okay with anything in my life. An hour later, Amelia found herself perched on a rock by the shore, watching as Lucas patiently explained the ecosystem of a tide pool to an enraptured Sophie. The sight made her chest swell with an emotion so big it was almost overwhelming. This was her family now, not by blood, but by choice, by love. Amelia, look, Sophie called, holding up a small hermit crab. Isn't he cute? Can we keep him? Amelia made her way over, careful not to slip on the wet rocks. He is cute, she agreed, but I think he'd be happier here with his friends. Why don't we take a picture instead? As Sophie nodded eagerly, Lucas shot Amelia a grateful look. They were still navigating the waters of co-parenting, but moments like these made Amelia feel like they were getting it right. Later that afternoon, after dropping Sophie off at school, Amelia found herself in front of Maggie's cafe. The help wanted sign in the window made her pause. Inside, The familiar scent of coffee and freshly baked muffins enveloped her. Maggie looked up from behind the counter, her face lighting up. "Amelia, dear, what brings you in so early?" Amelia's fingers traced the edge of the counter, memories of her first day in Rockport flooding back. "Actually, Maggie, I was wondering if that job offer was still open." Maggie's eyebrows shot up. "The part-time barista position?" "Honey, are you sure? It's a far cry from being a big city food critic." "I'm sure," Amelia said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do next, and I realised I don't want to just write about food anymore. I want to create it, to be part of a community that comes together over meals and coffee and conversation." Maggie's eyes misted over as she pulled Amelia into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you have no idea how happy that makes me. When can you start?" As Amelia tied on an apron and stepped behind the counter, she felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen, and she wouldn't have it any other way. The afternoon rush kept her busy, but Amelia found herself energized by the work. She chatted with locals, recommended pastries, and even started experimenting with latte art. By the time Lucas walked in, a smear of flour on her cheek and a bright smile on her face, she knew she'd made the right decision. "Well, well," Lucas said, leaning on the counter with a grin. "If it isn't Rockport's newest barista. How's the first day going?" Amelia's response was to hand him a mug of coffee, the foam artfully shaped into a heart. "See for yourself." Lucas's eyes widened as he took a sip. "Wow, that might be the best cup of coffee I've ever had." "Flatterer," Amelia teased, but she felt a flush of pride at his words. As the cafe quieted down, Amelia joined Lucas at a corner table, their hands intertwined on the weathered wood surface. "I have a surprise for you," Lucas said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I hope you'll like it." He pulled out a small, gift-wrapped package and slid it across the table. Amelia unwrapped it carefully, gasping when she saw what was inside. It was a book. Her book. A Taste of Home. Culinary Adventures in a Small Coastal Town by Amelia Foster. "Lucas," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "How—" "I may have sent your notebook to a publisher friend of mine," he admitted. "Your writing was too good to stay hidden. This is just a proof copy, but they want to publish it. If you're interested, that is." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she flipped through the pages, seeing her notes and recipes transformed into a beautiful culinary memoir. "It's perfect," she whispered, looking up at Lucas with shining eyes. "You're perfect. How did I get so lucky?" Lucas squeezed her hand. "I'm the lucky one. You gave up everything to take a chance on us. On this town. I fall more in love with you every day, watching you build a life here, seeing you with Sophie." He trailed off, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. "Which is why I was hoping—" "Well..." Amelia's breath caught as Lucas pulled out a small velvet box. "Lucas?" He opened it to reveal a ring, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. It reminded Amelia of the ocean on a sunny day. "Amelia Foster," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You came into our lives like a summer storm, unexpected and beautiful, and changing everything in your wake. Will you marry me? Be a part of our family officially?" For a moment, Amelia couldn't speak. She thought of the life she'd left behind in New York, of the uncertainty she'd felt stepping into this new world. And then she thought of mornings watching the sunrise, of Sophie's laughter, of the warmth of Lucas's embrace. "Yes," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks, even as she smiled so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes, of course, yes." As Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her in for a kiss, the cafe erupted in cheers. Amelia looked around to see familiar faces beaming at them. Maggie wiping away tears, old Joe tipping his cap, even Mrs. Callahan from the shell stand giving them a thumbs up through the window. This was her home now. These people were her family. And Lucas was her everything. Later that evening, as they walked along the beach hand in hand, Sophie running ahead to chase the waves, Amelia felt a sense of peace she'd never known before. "Happy?" Lucas asked, squeezing her hand. Amelia looked at him, at Sophie, at the town twinkling with lights as the sun set behind it. She thought of her new job, her book, the ring sparkling on her finger. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," she said softly. "I'm home." As they continued their walk, the sound of the waves a gentle backdrop to their laughter and conversation, Amelia knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, a wedding to plan. But with Lucas by her side and Sophie's hand in hers, she was ready for whatever the tides might bring. Because here, in this small coastal town, Amelia Foster had found more than just a place to live. She'd found where she truly belonged,